It was one of those evenings that felt almost too perfect, the kind where everything seemed to fall into place without effort. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Inside their modest suburban home, Marcus and Elena were settling into the calm rhythm of their nightly routine. Dinner had been simple but satisfying, spaghetti with garlic bread, and now the dishes were stacked neatly on the drying rack. Their two kids, a bubbly 8-year-old named Lily and her mischievous 6-year-old brother Max, were upstairs playing, with their toys, their laughter occasionally drifting down the staircase. Marcus leaned back in his chair at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee as he flipped through the local newspaper. Elena, meanwhile, was tidying up the living room, humming softly to herself. She always did that when she cleaned. It was something Marcus loved about her. Her voice wasn't loud, but it filled the space with warmth, making even mundane tasks feel cozy. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. A few streetlights flickered on as dusk settled in, casting soft glows across manicured lawns. It was peaceful, a rare moment of stillness in an otherwise busy world. But peace has a way of being fragile. The first sign that something was wrong came as a sharp knock on the front door. Not a polite tap tap tap, but a forceful pounding that echoed through the house. Marcus frowned, setting his coffee mug down. "Were you expecting anyone?" he called out to Elena, who shook her head as she walked toward the entryway. "No," she replied, her brow furrowing slightly. "Maybe it's a neighbor?" Marcus stood up and moved to join her, peering through the peephole before opening the door. What he saw made his stomach drop. Standing on the porch were several figures clad in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by helmets and visors. They carried rifles and wore badges that identified them as part of the SWAT team. Behind them, parked haphazardly along the curb, were multiple police vehicles, their flashing blue and red lights slicing through the evening darkness. Before Marcus could say a word, the lead officer barked, "Open up! We have a warrant!" His heart raced. A warrant? For what? He hadn't done anything wrong, not recently anyway. Neither had Elena. They were ordinary people leading ordinary lives. Confusion quickly gave way to panic as the officers pushed past him, ignoring his protests. One of them shoved the door open wider, nearly knocking Marcus off balance. Others flooded into the house, shouting commands that blurred together in a cacophony of noise. "Get down. Hands where we can see them." Elena stepped forward instinctively, her hands raised in surrender. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "What's going on? You're scaring my kids!" Her plea went unanswered. Instead, one of the officers grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her away from the staircase where Lily and Max now stood, frozen, wide-eyed and terrified. Marcus tried to intervene, calling out for them to stop, but another officer shoved him backward, pinning him against the wall. And then it happened. Without warning, one of the officers pulled out a taser and fired. There was a crackling sound followed by a scream that pierced the air. Elena collapsed to the floor, convulsing violently as electricity coursed through her body. Her cries echoed through the house, mingling with the shouts of the officers and the frightened whimpers of the children upstairs. Marcus watched in horror, unable to move. His mind screamed at him to do something, to protect his wife, to shield his family, but his body refused to obey. All he could do was stare as Elena writhed on the ground, her face contorted in agony. Time seemed to slow down, each second, stretching into an eternity. The scene was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. Yet here it was, unfolding right in front of him. When the taser finally stopped, Elena lay motionless for a moment, gasping for breath. Then she began to sob, her chest heaving as she curled into a fetal position. The sound of her crying cut deeper than any knife ever could. Marcus felt a surge of anger boiling inside him, but it was tempered by fear, for his wife, for his children, for himself. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not to them. The officers continued moving through the house, searching rooms and overturning furniture. Their movements were mechanical, devoid of empathy or reason. To them, this was just another job, another raid. But to Marcus and Elena, it was a violation, a brutal intrusion into their lives that left scars far deeper than any physical injury. As the chaos swirled around him, Marcus forced himself to focus. He couldn't let his emotions take over. If he wanted to protect his family, he needed to stay calm. He locked eyes with the commanding officer who was standing nearby, barking orders into a radio. Something inside Marcus clicked. He didn't know if it was courage or desperation, but whatever it was, it gave him the strength to speak up. The moment Elena hit the floor, convulsing from the taser's electric shock, the world seemed to stop for Marcus. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum, each beat drowning out the shouts of the officers and the chaos around him. He wanted to rush to her side, to hold her and shield her from whatever was happening, but he couldn't move. One of the officers had pinned him against the wall, their hands pressing firmly into his shoulders as if daring him to try something. Marcus could feel the cold sweat breaking out on his forehead, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the sight of Elena lying there, trembling and crying, told him otherwise. Elena's screams echoed through the house, sharp and piercing, cutting through the noise of boots stomping across the wooden floors and furniture being overturned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror as she struggled to breathe. The kids upstairs must have heard everything. Marcus could picture them cowering in fear, too scared to come down or even call out for help. What kind of monster would do this? What possible reason could these officers have for treating an innocent family like criminals? Marcus didn't understand, and the not knowing made it worse. Every second felt like an eternity. The officer who had tased Elena stood nearby, his weapon still raised as though ready to fire again if anyone moved wrong. His expression was unreadable behind his helmet and visor, but Marcus noticed the slight hesitation in his stance. Maybe he hadn't expected Elena to collapse so violently. Or maybe he realized, just for a split second, that something about this raid didn't add up. Whatever it was, it gave Marcus a tiny flicker of hope, a fragile thread to cling to in the midst of the storm. "Please," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "She didn't do anything. She's just my wife." No one responded. The other officers continued tearing through the house, flipping over couch cushions, dumping drawers onto the floor and shouting commands at each other. They were searching for something, but what? Drugs? Weapons? Contraband? None of it made sense. Marcus and Elena weren't involved in anything illegal. They were ordinary people leading ordinary lives. Yet here they were, caught in the middle of a nightmare that seemed ripped straight from a crime drama. Elena finally stopped shaking, her body going limp as she lay curled up on the floor. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with the dust and debris kicked up by the officer's boots. Her sobs were quieter now, more exhausted than frightened, but they cut deeper than any scream ever could. Marcus locked eyes with her for a brief moment, trying to convey reassurance without words. He wanted her to know that he was still here, that he wasn't going anywhere. But inside, he was falling apart. How could he protect his family when he couldn't even protect himself? One of the officers grabbed Marcus roughly by the arm and shoved him toward the center of the room. "On your knees," the man barked, his voice harsh and commanding. Marcus complied, dropping to the floor with his hands raised above his head. His knees thudded against the hard surface, sending a jolt of pain shooting up his legs, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was Elena, lying just a few feet away, and the kids upstairs, probably watching everything unfold in terrified silence. The leader of the SWAT team stepped forward, his presence dominating the room. He was taller than the others, his posture rigid and authoritative. A badge gleamed on his chest, catching the dim light of the living room lamp. Marcus looked up at him, searching for some sign of humanity beneath the tactical gear. Instead, he saw only cold determination. The man barked orders into a radio clipped to his shoulder, his tone clipped and efficient. To him, this was just another operation, another house to clear. He didn't seem to care or even notice the devastation he was leaving in his wake. As the search continued, Marcus's mind raced. There had to be a way out of this, some way to make them see that they were wrong. He glanced around the room, taking in the destruction. Photo frames lay shattered on the floor, their glass shards glinting like tiny knives. Toys belonging to Lily and Max were scattered everywhere, their bright colors standing out starkly against the mess. It was as if the officers had deliberately set out to dismantle every piece of happiness in the house, and then it hit him. The warrant. If they truly believed they had the right to be here, they must have a warrant. That document was the key to proving their innocence if only he could get his hands on it. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Marcus spoke up, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "What are you looking for?" he asked, addressing the commander directly. His tone was calm, almost conversational, which seemed to catch the officer off guard. For a moment no one moved. Then the commander turned to look at him, his brow furrowing slightly. "That's none of your concern," the man replied gruffly, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Marcus seized the opportunity, pressing further. "You're in the wrong place," he said firmly, his words ringing out clearly in the suddenly quiet room. "We haven't done anything wrong. Show me the warrant." The commander hesitated, exchanging a glance with one of his subordinates. Marcus could see the wheels turning in their heads, the faintest flicker of doubt creeping into their expressions. They weren't expecting resistance, not this kind anyway. Most people would have stayed silent, too afraid to challenge authority. But Marcus wasn't most people. He had nothing to hide, and he wasn't about to let his family suffer because of someone else's mistake. "Show me the warrant," Marcus repeated, louder this time. His voice carried a weight that demanded attention, cutting through the tension like a knife. The officers paused mid-search, their movements slowing as they processed what he'd said. Even Elena, still lying on the floor, turned her head slightly to look at him. There was a new energy in the room, a shift in the balance of power. For the first time since the raid began, Marcus felt like he might actually have a chance to turn things around. The commander reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, scanning its contents before handing it over to Marcus. As Marcus took it, his hands trembled. Not from fear, but from anticipation. He scanned the document quickly, his eyes darting across the page until he found what he was looking for. The address listed at the top wasn't theirs. It belonged to an empty lot 2 streets over, a vacant property that hadn't seen human activity in years. "Well?" the commander asked, his tone sharper now, tinged with unease. "What does it say?" Marcus looked up, meeting the officer's gaze without flinching. "It says you've got the wrong house," he replied simply, holding the paper out for everyone to see. "This isn't where you're supposed to be." The room fell silent. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence wavering. One by one, they began to realize the gravity of their mistake. Slowly, reluctantly, they started lowering their weapons. The commander muttered something under his breath, shaking his head as he signaled for his team to regroup. The once chaotic scene dissolved into awkward silence as reality set in. They had invaded the wrong home, terrorized an innocent family, and nearly caused irreversible harm, all because of a simple mix-up. For Marcus, the relief was overwhelming. He knelt beside Elena, pulling her into his arms as she sobbed quietly into his chest. Upstairs, Lily and Max peeked cautiously around the corner, their faces pale but relieved. Though the danger had passed, the emotional toll lingered. The damage had been done, and it would take more than an apology to undo it. But for now, Marcus allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction. Those 5 words, "You're making a huge mistake," had changed everything. They had forced the SWAT team to pause, to reconsider, and ultimately, to recognize the gravity of their actions. In that moment, Marcus realized the power of speaking the truth, especially when faced with overwhelming odds. Sometimes all it takes is a few carefully chosen words to turn the tide. End of expanded part 2. Would you like me to revise or expand any specific sections further? The room was thick with tension, a heavy silence settling over everything except for Elena's ragged breathing. Marcus stood frozen, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But he also knew that panicking wouldn't help anyone, not Elena, not his kids, and certainly not himself. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Why were these officers here? What did they want? And most importantly, how could he stop this nightmare from spiraling further out of control? Elena lay on the floor, her body trembling as she fought to regain her composure. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the sweat that had broken out across her forehead. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Why are they doing this?" she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible over the commotion around them. Marcus didn't have an answer. All he could do was kneel beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be okay," he murmured, though even he wasn't sure if he believed it. The words felt hollow, but they were all he had to offer in that moment. He glanced up at the officers, who were still shouting commands and tearing through the house as if searching for something. But what? There was nothing illegal in their home, no drugs, no weapons, nothing that would justify this kind of invasion. As Marcus took in the scene, his gaze landed on the commanding officer, a tall man with a stern expression etched onto his face. The officer stood near the center of the room, barking orders into a radio while keeping one hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. Something about the way he carried himself caught Marcus's attention. This wasn't just some random raid. There was purpose behind it, even if it seemed misplaced. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Marcus locked eyes with the commander. His voice came out steady, though inside he was anything but calm. "You're making a huge mistake," he said firmly, each word cutting through the chaos like a blade. At first, nothing happened. The room remained chaotic, the officers continuing their search without missing a beat. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere began to shift. One of the officers paused mid-step, glancing uncertainly at the commander. Another lowered his weapon slightly, his grip loosening ever so subtly. Even the commander himself hesitated, his head tilting slightly as if trying to process what he'd just heard. Marcus seized the moment, speaking again before anyone could react. "This isn't right," he continued, his tone unwavering. "We haven't done anything wrong. Whatever you're looking for, it's not here." For a brief second, time seemed to stand still. The noise faded into the background, leaving only the sound of Marcus's voice echoing in the room. It wasn't anger or aggression that fueled his words. It was clarity. He spoke with a quiet authority, as though he knew deep down that the truth was on his side. And maybe that's why the SWAT team froze. Maybe that's why, for the first time since they'd burst through the door, they actually listened. The commander stepped forward, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. He stopped a few feet away from Marcus, studying him with narrowed eyes. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice sharp but tinged with uncertainty. "I said you're making a mistake," Marcus repeated, meeting the officer's gaze without flinching. "If you'll let me explain, I can prove it to you." There was a long pause during which no one moved. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, the commander nodded curtly. "Fine," he said. "Talk." Taking a deep breath, Marcus began to explain. He told them about their quiet life in the suburbs, about how he worked as a mechanic and Elena volunteered at the local library. He mentioned their kids, Lily and Max, who were upstairs scared out of their minds. He described their daily routines, their friends, their neighbors, all the things that made them ordinary people living ordinary lives. Most importantly, he asked to see the warrant, pointing out that they deserved to know why their home had been turned upside down. As Marcus spoke, the officers exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence wavering. One by one, they began to realize that something wasn't adding up. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit together the way they should have. Slowly, reluctantly, the commander pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Marcus. Unfolding it with trembling hands, Marcus scanned the document quickly. His eyes widened as he spotted the address listed at the top. It wasn't theirs. The warrant was for an empty lot 2 streets over, a vacant property that hadn't seen human activity in years. Someone, somewhere, had made a catastrophic error. "Well?" the commander asked, his tone gruff but laced with unease. "What does it say?" Marcus looked up, his expression a mixture of disbelief and relief. "It says you've got the wrong house," he replied simply, holding the paper out for the officer to see. "This isn't where you're supposed to be." The impact of those words rippled through the room like a shockwave. For a moment no one spoke. Then slowly the officers began to lower their weapons. The commander muttered something under his breath, shaking his head as he signaled for his team to regroup. The once chaotic scene dissolved into awkward silence as reality set in. They had invaded the wrong home, terrorized an innocent family, and nearly caused irreversible harm, all because of a simple mix-up. Elena clung to Marcus, her tears subsiding as the immediate threat passed. Upstairs, Lily and Max peeked cautiously around the corner, their faces pale but relieved. Though the danger had lifted, the emotional toll lingered. The damage had been done, and it would take more than an apology to undo it. But for now, Marcus allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction. Those 5 words, "You're making a huge mistake," had changed everything. They had forced the SWAT team to pause, to reconsider, and ultimately to recognize the gravity of their actions. In that moment, Marcus realized the power of speaking the truth, especially when faced with overwhelming odds. Sometimes, all it takes is a few carefully chosen words to turn the tide. As the officers filed out of the house, leaving behind a trail of overturned furniture and shattered peace, Marcus wrapped an arm around Elena and held her close. Together, they stood in the wreckage of their once calm evening, vowing silently to fight for justice and to ensure that no other family would have to endure what they had just survived. The SWAT team's departure left behind a silence so profound it felt almost suffocating. The house, once warm and inviting, now seemed cold and foreign. Furniture was overturned, drawers had been yanked out and emptied onto the floor, and the faint scent of adrenaline still hung in the air. Marcus stood in the middle of the living room, his arms wrapped protectively around Elena, who was trembling despite her best efforts to stay strong. Upstairs, Lily and Max sat huddled together on their parents' bed, too scared to move or speak. The chaos of the raid may have ended, but its aftermath loomed heavily over the family. For a long while, no one said anything. Words felt inadequate, as if they couldn't possibly capture the magnitude of what had just happened. Finally, Elena broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" she asked, looking up at Marcus with tear-filled eyes. Marcus didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure himself. His mind raced with questions. Who could they trust? Where should they start? And how could they hold anyone accountable for what had been done to them? But he knew one thing for certain. They couldn't let this go unanswered. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about ensuring that no other family would have to endure such an ordeal. "We start by telling our story," Marcus said finally, his tone firm but gentle. "We tell everyone, the police department, the media, anyone who will listen. They need to know what happened here tonight." Elena nodded slowly, though doubt lingered in her expression. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" she asked. "It has to," Marcus replied. "If we don't fight back, then nothing changes, and I can't live with that." Over the next few days, the couple began piecing their lives back together, literally and figuratively. They cleaned up the mess left by the officers, straightening furniture and putting belongings back where they belonged. It was tedious work, but it gave them something to focus on, a way to channel their frustration into action. Meanwhile, Marcus reached out to local news outlets, sharing their story with reporters who were eager to investigate the botched raid. Word spread quickly, and soon the incident became the talk of the town. Neighbors stopped by to offer support, bringing casseroles and heartfelt apologies. Some admitted they'd heard the commotion that night but hadn't known what to do. Others expressed outrage, vowing to join Marcus and Elena in demanding accountability. Even strangers from across the city reached out, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. For the first time since the raid, Marcus and Elena felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't alone in this fight, but not everyone reacted with sympathy. When Marcus filed a formal complaint with the police department's Internal Affairs Division, he encountered resistance. The officers involved claimed they had followed protocol, insisting the mix-up with the address was an honest mistake. Their commander issued a brief apology, but it came across as insincere, a mere formality rather than a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Worse still, there was no immediate indication that any disciplinary action would be taken against. Those responsible frustrated but undeterred, Marcus decided to take matters into his own hands. He spent hours poring over legal documents, researching cases of similar incidents and learning about citizens' rights. He contacted lawyers, advocacy groups, and community leaders, determined to build a case that would force the department to take responsibility. Elena, though still recovering emotionally, joined him in these efforts, using her connections at the library to gather resources and organize meetings with other affected families. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table surrounded by papers and notes, Elena looked at Marcus and smiled faintly. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd see you like this. So, driven?" Marcus chuckled softly, running a hand through his hair. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But when someone messes with my family, they mess with me. I won't let them get away with it." Their resolve only grew stronger as they delved deeper into the issue. They discovered that mistakes like the one made at their home weren't as rare as they'd hoped. Across the country, there were countless stories of wrongful raids, many of which resulted in far more devastating consequences. Some families had lost loved ones. Others had been traumatized beyond repair. Reading these accounts filled Marcus and Elena with both anger and determination. If systemic change was needed, they were willing to be the ones to push for it. As weeks turned into months, their advocacy began to gain traction. Local newspapers published articles highlighting their story. Complete sentences, please. As weeks turned into months, their advocacy began to gain traction. Local newspapers published articles highlighting their story, complete with interviews and photographs of the family standing outside their home. Television stations picked up the story too, airing segments that showed the emotional toll the raid had taken on Marcus, Elena, and their children. The more people heard about what had happened, the angrier they became. Neighbors organized rallies in support of the family, holding signs that read "Justice for the Innocent" and "Accountability Now." Even strangers from other towns joined in, flooding social media with messages of solidarity. The growing attention put pressure on the police department to act. At first, officials tried to downplay the incident, calling it an unfortunate but unavoidable mistake. But as public outrage mounted, they were forced to take the matter seriously. An internal investigation was launched, and though progress was slow, it marked the beginning of a long overdue reckoning. Officers involved in the raid were questioned, and disciplinary actions, ranging from suspensions to mandatory retraining programs, were eventually handed down. While the punishments weren't as severe as Marcus and Elena had hoped, they were a start. More importantly, the case sparked conversations about reform within law enforcement, particularly regarding the use of SWAT teams and the importance of double-checking warrants before raids. For Marcus and Elena, the fight wasn't just about justice for themselves, it was about preventing similar tragedies in the future. They began attending city council meetings, speaking passionately about the need for stricter oversight and accountability measures. They partnered with civil rights organizations to draft proposals aimed at improving transparency and reducing errors in high-stakes operations. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. Lawmakers started listening, introducing legislation that required additional safeguards, such as independent reviews of all SWAT deployments and mandatory body cameras for officers involved in raids. Despite the progress, healing wasn't easy. The trauma of that night lingered, manifesting in ways both big and small. Elena struggled with anxiety, often jumping at sudden noises or feeling uneasy when strangers approached her. Marcus found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, always on edge. Lily and Max, once carefree and playful, became quieter and more withdrawn. Nightmares plagued them all, reminders of the chaos that had invaded their home. To cope, the family leaned on each other and on the community that had rallied around them. Friends and neighbors checked in regularly, offering meals, babysitting, and words of encouragement. A local therapist volunteered her time to help the family process their emotions, teaching them techniques to manage stress and rebuild trust. Slowly but surely, they began to find moments of peace again. Game nights returned to the living room. Laughter echoed through the halls, and bedtime stories resumed without interruption. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step forward. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, Marcus and Elena sat together on the porch, watching Lily and Max chase fireflies in the backyard. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. For the first time in months, they felt a sense of calm, a fragile but undeniable hope that things might one day return to normal. "You know," Elena said softly, breaking the silence, "I never thought we'd get through this." Marcus reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're stronger than we think," he replied with a small smile. "And we've got each other. That makes all the difference." Their journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had come a long way since that fateful night. They had faced unimaginable fear, stood up to those who had wronged them, and emerged as voices for change. And while scars remained, both visible and invisible, they wore them as badges of resilience, proof that they had survived something no family should ever have to endure. People often asked Marcus how he had managed to stay so composed during the raid, especially after seeing Elena tased in front of him. Each time he gave the same answer. "It wasn't about being brave," he explained. "It was about knowing I had to protect my family. When you love someone that much, you'll do whatever it takes, even if it means finding your voice in the hardest moment of your life." Those 5 words, "You're making a huge mistake," had become a symbol of their fight. They represented not only the turning point in their own story, but also the power of speaking truth to authority. To Marcus and Elena, they served as a reminder that sometimes the simplest acts of courage can have the greatest impact. As the fireflies danced in the twilight and the kids' laughter filled the air, Marcus and Elena allowed themselves a rare moment of reflection. They had been through hell, but they had emerged stronger, more united, and determined to make a difference. The road ahead would still be challenging, but they faced it with unwavering resolve. Together, they had proven that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through, and that perhaps was the most powerful lesson of all. End of expanded Part 5.